Okay, I think we'll get started. We might have some more participants joining us in the chat. So thank you everybody for joining us for this virtual event on remigration and the new far-right politics of mass deportation. This webinar is being hosted by the Center for the Study of Organized Hate, or CSOH, which is a think tank headquartered in Washington, D.C., that is focused on understanding and preventing and combating the multifaceted phenomenon of organized hate. We primarily conduct research on hate, violence, extremism, radicalism, and associated online harms geared towards policy advocacy and public engagement. My name is Avian Leidig, and I am the Director of Research and Outreach at CSOH, and I'm pleased to be moderating today's virtual event. Now, the basis for our event today is the report that CSOH published in January titled Remigration, the Rise of a Fringe Idea into the Political Mainstream. For those who might be unfamiliar with the concept of remigration, it originates from the French author Renaud Camus, who also infamously coined the Great Replacement theory, a population replacement theory, conspiracy theory, which alleges that leftist politicians and the quote globalist elite are deliberately undermining birth rates in Western countries through increased non-white immigration levels in order to tip the demographic balance. Remigration, in parallel, refers to the mass deportation of non-white immigrants, regardless of their citizenship status. The phrase has become the latest call to action, viewed as a solution to the alleged denigrating effects of the Great Replacement. For the far right, the Great Replacement is considered the diagnosis for society, while remigration is the prognosis. Our report tracked and analyzed when remigration first appeared online in 2010 and rose in prominence over the last 15 years before gaining mainstream visibility in 2025. Over the years, interpretations of remigration have evolved to adapt to different geographical contexts, especially from Europe, where remigration narratives portray Muslim migrants as a demographic threat to white European societies, to the US, where remigration is most often directed towards particularly undocumented migrants and used as justification for ongoing immigration and customs enforcement, or ICE, deportation efforts. Importantly, the transnational architecture of social media has made the exchange of ideas around remigration highly visible and rapidly scalable. Now, joining us today to discuss the rise in popularity of the remigration concept are our three esteemed panelists on the screen. The first, Shada Islam, is an award-winning Brussels-based journalist and think tanker who now works independently as an advisor, analyst, strategist, and writer on Europe, Africa, Asia, geopolitics, trade, and race diversity and inclusion. Her columns are published in the EU Observer, The Guardian, with an excellent piece published just yesterday, and on her own Substack. Shada worked for 9 years as Director of Europe and Geopolitics at Friends of Europe, an influential independent think tank based in Brussels, and she now runs her own Brussels-based global media strategy and advisory company, New Horizons Project. In 2017, Politico identified Shada as one of Brussels' 20 most influential women. In 2023, 2024, and last year, 2025, she was on the ZN Consulting list of 50 top influencers. Shada has won the European of the Year Media Awards from the European Movement International and from the Association of European Journalists of Catalonia. Also joining us today is Shabna Begum. Shabna is CEO of the Runnymede Trust and was Director of Research there before her current post. Her leadership has been at the heart of all the Runnymede Trust's recent projects, including research on education, police in schools, and more broadly around the cost of living crisis, the experiences of women of color in the workplace, racism in migration debates, and most recently on Islamophobia. Before running Mead, Shabna worked as a teacher and head of social science in London schools for over 20 years. In 2021, she completed a PhD at Queen Mary University, London, based on her family's experience of migration and racism in 1970s East London as an entry point to a wider community history around a Bengal squatters movement. She went on to translate that into a book, From Sylhet to Spitalfields, Bengali Squatters in 1970s East London, published with Lawrence and Wishart in 2022. And finally, with us is Heidi Beirich. Heidi is an expert on the American and European far right, including white supremacist, anti-immigrant, anti-government, and other extremist movements. In 2020, Heidi co-founded the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism to monitor and counter increasingly transnational hate movements, particularly in areas of the world where capacity is limited to combat far-right movements that threaten human rights and democracy. Heidi has testified in Congress on issues related to extremism in the military and among veterans, and on the dangers of accelerationist and neo-Nazi movements. The House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol sought her testimony on the threat posed by the extremist Proud Boys and on the history of the rise of white supremacy in the U.S. Government agencies and tech companies have sought her advice on policies to combat hate speech, hate crimes, and domestic terrorism. Before co-founding the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism, Heidi led the Southern Poverty Law Center's Intelligence Project, the premier organization tracking hate and anti-government movements in the United States. So really a stellar panel lineup that we have here today. So I will allow each panelist to provide their opening remarks before we will move into a discussion between all of us. So I'll hand it off first to Shada.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone from Brussels. So everyone, we've come a long way, and it's been a slippery slope since November 2023, when a group of Germans met in secret in Potsdam Hotel to discuss what they call remigration. And, you know, there was quite an outrage at that meeting. There were politicians who said they were dismayed. Citizens took to the streets. And for a moment, it did seem like a line had been crossed, and that the ideas that were being formulated in Potsdam by this clandestine group were not acceptable. But the fact is that the remigration ideas did not just disappear. In fact, they found fertile ground across Europe. So they just adapted and entered the mainstream discourse. I have to say, with the help of mainstream politicians. I'll talk a little bit about that, and also a very compliant and non-questioning media. So a quick snapshot of Europe today. First, as Evian has said, remigration is being presented as the solution to the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which very falsely claims that white Europeans are being deliberately replaced by non-white, often Muslim populations. And of course, this strikes fears in many hearts. And both these terms are the brainchild of the one man, French writer Renaud Camus. And I've been reading Ibram X. Kendi's Chain of Ideas, and it's very, very clear just how these ideas have gone from the fringes to the mainstream. And I think the report that Evian's organization has drawn up does that also very, very well. So that's the first point. And the second point is that these ideas have found traction because they build on Europe's very familiar colonial and racial hierarchies that were never fully dismantled, only repackaged. And so they found fertile ground, as I said. And third, these ideas are gaining oxygen and traction because of the collapse of the so-called cordon sanitaire, the separation between mainstream conservative parties and the far right. So in many of our parliaments, the far right have had increased votes, they're there, more seats, and their influence, I would say their toxic influence is very, very palpable in the policies and actions. And of course, many of our governments, including in Italy, are in the hands of radical right and or they have the support of radical right politicians. And fourth, and this is very especially European, I think, and I talk about it in my articles for The Guardian and elsewhere, Europeans, EU institutions especially, are using technocratic, bureaucratic, pseudo-academic terms. So there are no references, if you like, to remigration or mass deportations. So the elite in Europe refers to, and I quote, policy of returns, of burden sharing of refugees and migrants. We talk about capacity limits, integration fatigue, social cohesion, and that old chestnut defending European values. So all of these are actually dog whistles and very coded language. When you know, you know. And so they're generally not challenged by rather clueless politicians, progressive politicians who are not doing their job as they should be doing, or by the larger EU ecosystem, or by the media. And fifth point, there's a very visible lack of representation within EU institutions of our ethnic and racial and religious minorities. So barely 3% of the 750 or so members of parliament, of the European Parliament, only 3% are from racial and ethnic minorities, whereas, data shows that 10% of European population is of non-white Europeans. And EU institutions are still very white and Eurocentric, what I refer to sometimes as Brussels so white. So sixth point, and remigration is gaining traction when there is an increased focus on European Muslims and more generally on racialized Europeans who show up for pro-Palestinian solidarity demonstrations, and whether this happens in public or in private, in the choice of the dress, if they're wearing the keffiyeh or not. So once again, the fertile ground that I spoke about is there. So behind all of this, and this is where I think we need to be very honest, we have to acknowledge that at its core, this debate in Europe is about identity, about who is a European, a genuine, true European, and who is not. And then when push comes to shove, the core of the message is Europeanness is whiteness. And that's the unspoken benchmark of belonging. So not a biological fact, but actually a political and social construct. And the debate in Europe, raging in all kinds of forms and formats, is really about that. Who is a European? Who belongs here? And who is dispensable, disposable, and can go home? Quote unquote home again. So we're really talking about the most obvious and visible sign of this migration and remigration debate is really in our migration policies. And when Donald Trump, the first administration, was there, the Europeans were actually quite, I have to say, genuinely shocked by some of the very harsh measures, the border control measures that were being taken by the first administration of Trump. Today, in many ways, we're actually following in the footsteps. So if you look at the EU's Migration and Asylum Pact, which was adopted in 2024, after years of debate, I have to say, it's not very dissimilar from what's happening in America today. With the same kind of talk about border procedures being accelerated despite human rights conventions and laws, fast-track deportations, the use of safe third countries, and there are controversial rules that asylum seekers can be sent to these so-called safe third countries, even when there's no connection between them. Frontex, which is our border police, has been getting more money, has been strengthened, and has been engaging allegedly in illegal pushbacks. So all of this, sounds, when you're talking about migration pact, and all of this sounds very sort of technocratic. And in fact, it is a smokescreen from some rather strong ideas. And I always say that this narrative that we've got in our migration policies, even our visa policies, is really inspired by what Edward Said, the Palestinian-American scholar, has called Orientalism, which is the definition of the other. We all know what he says as a lesser being, chaotic, exotic, and intrinsically suspicious. And also, if you've read Hanif Qureshi, who's a British author, he's called Europe's collective hallucination about migration, about the refugee being a terrible fiction, a dangerous person. So this great replacement moral panic takes many different forms. I will just refer to a few. I was personally horrified when German Chancellor Friedrich Merz spoke recently about changing cityscapes, in which he said women would feel unsafe. That was his imaginary. And this was, of course, a reference to a migrant population in Berlin and other cities in Germany. And Denmark's Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, distinguishes between Western and non-Western migrants in their capacity to integrate. In France, there is talk of secularism, of course, but a new concept that has entered also, which is quite, I think, strange and dangerous. This is about entryism, which reframes Muslim civic participation as a form of infiltration. So citizens as potential internal threats. In the Netherlands, there are also similar conspiracy theories that are being discussed. And one that I found really interesting is that suggesting that it's precisely the Muslims who are educated, articulate, and integrated who pose the greatest risk because they can influence institutions from within. So in Northern Europe, the talk is about incentivized return. So, people being paid to go back, and that's a soft form of coercion. In Central and Eastern Europe, this whole conversation tends to be more openly about civilizational terms as a threat to Christian and white Europe. So different forms in different countries, depending on the national landscape. So from where I'm sitting, at the moment, because Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has now been defeated in election, there is a certain sort of feeling that, this means that we can now go back, or, the visionary, the imaginary back where we were less racist. But as I argue in my article in The Guardian, this is a problem of systemic, institutionalized, structured racism. It isn't just because of one or two big bad apples. This is happening across the European Union because, and this is also something that we need to look into, this is happening because we haven't resolved our colonial prejudices, biases, and the racism and racial hierarchies that are in it. So my final point will be, amid this gloom and doom, there is, however, some hope. And I would point to the one EU leader, Spain's Pedro Sanchez, who is striking a very different posture in his determination to pursue a different, more inclusive path, which is aligned with the EU's authentic, true democratic values. And the question I ask myself is, will others in Europe be as honest and brave enough to follow Sanchez's lead? And I believe that the answer to that question, Evian, will define our future in Europe.
Great. Thank you so much, Shada, I think for setting such a high bar for all of us in our conversation today, and also for providing that really constructive overview, acknowledging the fact that, remigration itself, it is a signal, but, it is oftentimes deeply embedded within the context in which it emerges from, right? And I think it was an excellent point to bring out the systemic and the structural conditions that have lent to its emergence, and the fact that there has been this collapse within the cordon sanitaire that has allowed what could have been once a rather fringe narrative, but actually shows that it's deeply embedded in sort of mainstreamed racism and talking points. So very much appreciate your intervention. I'm going to hand it over to Shabna now to discuss, how remigration has come to manifest within the UK context.
Thank you, Evian, and thank you, Shada, as well, for such a thoughtful and really comprehensive introduction to the conversation. As Evian said, the Runnymede Trust is a racial justice charity and think tank, and actually we were founded in 1968, which is a year in UK politics when we had a Conservative Party politician called Enoch Powell express what was famous later, or famously known as the Rivers of Blood speech. And in that speech in 1968, in his Birmingham constituency, he made a claim around the inevitability of a race war because of the levels of migration that the UK was witnessing in that post-war period. And he claimed that the rivers of blood would flow because the whip hand would be in the throes of the black man. So he was he was criticised, he was challenged, and he was eventually removed from his from the Conservative Party. He was expelled because of the claims that he had made, and they were considered controversial back in 1968. It's the year that I said that the Runnymede Trust was also founded. We were founded as a racial justice charity and think tank to address some of those challenges and to address some of the conversations and narratives that were alive and vibrant at the time, and they revolved around the claims that migration was undermining the cohesion, the coherency, and the integrity of what was defined as British, and that needed to be addressed. So from the very beginnings of the work that we've been doing, we have focused our work on conversations that have been triggered between migration debates and racial justice. And so that's always been our kind of bread and butter work. The reports that CSOH have published is really, really interesting and really timely as well. I think that two of the things that I really wanted to pull out was the way in which the report really thinks about roots. And I mean roots in terms of the kind of genealogy and the lineage and the pollination of these ideas, and how they have occupied different forms of language, different terminology, some very kind of the euphemistic language that's used in order to try and conceal some of the real inherent danger and kind of hostility of some of the narratives and policies that are embedded within it. But I think also, and has also been kind of highlighted by Shadow's contribution already as well, is the roots in terms of the geographies of this, of what we're seeing happening, the transnational nature of the narratives and the development, and also the life energy that is kind of generated by these conversations that very much span a global agenda. In terms of the UK, the remigration debate has come back alive again, and it is a very active part of the discussion. And we know that whether we track that through in terms of online social media posts and how popular that term has been in terms of social media posts that's reported in the CSOH report. But also we've seen things like the UK rally last year, which was the biggest far-right demonstration that we have seen in British history. That was on the 13th of September, led by a far-right activist called Tommy Robinson, who I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. And at that rally, which was, like I said, the biggest far-right rally, we had calls for remigration, we had calls for mass deportation. So we've had the kind of politics on the street and in terms of protests. We've had the remigration debate also infecting some of our more fringe political parties, whether that's Restore Britain, led by Rupert Lowe, a sitting MP, who has also called actively for remigration and published a policy document of 133 pages where he outlines exactly what that should look like. But then we've also had the mainstreaming of that as well. And I think that the Reform UK party are a party that may not use directly the language of remigration, but have very actively supported and campaigned for and said that they would stand for deportations, mass deportations, promising 600,000 people would be deported and so on. And we have seen that kind of trickle, that creep of politics from the fringes into kind of fringe parties, into more mainstream parties, and then how that has tracked through to our more traditional mainstream parties as well. And so the remigration debate may not be explicit in the policies of either the Conservative or the Labour Party, but both of them have shifted in terms of their policy agenda, their policy proposals on migration. And we've seen that actively pursued by both political parties in this post-2024 context. One of the other things I think that the report does, and I'll kind of track through these things very quickly, is look at how certain events are exploited to create a sense of crisis, to create a sense of urgency around these debates and narratives. And so for us, the rally last year was also building on the riots of the year before, which were triggered by the kind of terrible tragedy of 3 young girls being killed. But that was associated with the Muslim community. It triggered a whole series of riots, attacks on Muslim communities, attacks on mosques, and a whole summer of rioting. And so we have seen how events are exploited to create a sense of a threat and insecurity. And so whether it was the Southport murders of 2024 or more recently and actively and ongoingly, the grooming gang scandal, where Asian men are pathologized, Asian Muslim men in particular, are pathologized as being hypersexualized, as being a threat to white women and so on. And so the last couple of points I wanted to make is that, again, as the report outlines, there is a deep Islamophobia that runs through the remigration narrative, and this idea that it is in particular the Muslim communities who are an active threat to the white Christian population of the UK. And as Shada said, actually right here in the UK, we've seen exactly the same thing where protests, Muslim communities who are part of wider protests are demonized as breaching our kind of our political system. When they vote, are described as being sectarian. And so there's this active demonization of the Muslim community and who are perceived as this threat. The only one thing that I wanted to say, which perhaps is different in the UK context and different to what Shada described there, is that actually what we have in the UK is lots of black and brown politicians who have been part of the political theatre of this, who have activated and supported and encouraged and enabled these policies. So this isn't, it speaks to Shada's point, though, that this is never about individuals. These are about systems, structures and policies that go through parties and systems. And even where we have got in the UK actually much more significant representation in quite significant political roles, whether it's a kind of Home Secretary or Foreign Secretary and so on, we have seen black and brown politicians who have activated the kind of the euphemistic or the softer versions, if we can call it that, of the remigration narrative. And that's something that perhaps we can come back to in the conversation.
Thanks very much, Shabna. Already we see quite a lot of overlap in what we're seeing in the UK and in Europe, but I do appreciate also the slight differences that you've pointed out, Shabna, as well, and the importance of contextualizing how a concept like remigration is something that can often latch on to then pre-existing conditions that are rooted into how, as you mentioned, systems, structures, and politics operate within these contexts. I want to hand it over to Heidi now. So let's jump over to the other side of the Atlantic for Heidi to offer her insights on remigration.
Well, thank you, Evian. Thank you, CSOH. The report was really excellent, and I very much appreciated this conversation in the European and the UK tech context. So thank you, Shada and Shabna. Here in the United States, remigration as a term actually first came in a post from Donald Trump during the campaign for his second presidency. So the leap of the actual word from the European neo-Nazi white supremacist and identitarian context to the United States came at the highest levels of government. And Donald Trump, of course, has run since the beginning, since the first term, on harsh anti-immigrant policies. His first comments when he came down that escalator in 2015 before his first administration were very nasty things said about Latino immigrants who are the target of these policies in the US context, which is a little different than the Islamophobia and anti-Muslim situation that you have in Europe. What's happened in the United States over the course of the last, since 2015 or so, is that the Republican Party has been transformed into an explicitly anti-immigrant party that views immigrants, even though the United States has many, many millions of immigrants, both here documented and undocumented, as a threat in the same way that you were talking about immigrant populations being pathologized in the European context. That has now happened for the Republican Party here in the United States. Starting under the first Trump administration, the idea of the Great Replacement, this conspiracy theory, became a prominent talking point, really a policy position across many, many leaders in the Republican Party, from the top to the state level to local levels. Uh, for many years now, they have been running on explicit Great Replacement language. So, non-white voters are here to replace white voters and give power to the Democratic Party. That's one version of this. They're here undermining culture. That's another version of it. Crime is the result of immigration. All of these sorts of theories have been infused into, I mean, they've been completely mainstreamed on the right. This is now the conversation about immigrants that's coming from there. In the years that Trump was out of office, between 2020 and 2024, the conservative movement writ large became explicitly anti-immigrant. And in many ways, this is captured by something called Project 2025, which was a plan for Trump's second administration, which he has now enacted about 50% of this policy agenda that was put together by more than 100 organizations on the right here in the United States. There were great influences from the Hungarian context on this effort, which I think is very important. In many ways, the American far right was following Viktor Orban's playbook. And part of that Project 2025 policy document was about immigration in the harshest terms you could imagine. Tent cities, rounding people up, mass deportations, and language around the fact that immigrants are corrosive to American society, corrosive to what they call now heritage Americans, which is essentially a code word for white people. And this is the agenda, the much more harsh agenda that Trump came into office with this last time around. During the campaign, he tweeted about remigration, probably in a context where most Americans had never heard of this term or even understood what exactly it is. And when Trump came into office, he did things that were explicitly white supremacist when it comes to immigration, which is what the remigration policy agenda, as Evian put it, it's a reply, it's the policy agenda reply to the Great Replacement, right? The Great Replacement is wiping out white people and their power. So what we need to do is remove all those non-white folks. And what I would argue is essentially an ethnic cleansing plan and re-empower white Americans. So Trump began tweeting about remigration. Other high-level policy folks here in the United States have used that language. The State Department has even proposed an Office of Remigration. It hasn't been put in place yet, but it's in their planning. Other aspects of this, besides, as everybody knows, the rounding up people on the streets, deporting them, violating court orders. I mean, killing two Americans in the process, rounding up people who are citizens. It's been quite horrifying. The Supreme Court giving a ruling justifying racial profiling as part of this process. It's something really that nobody in the United States has seen in terms of immigration policy, at least in my lifetime. Aside from all of that happening, there is also the Department of Homeland Security using explicit white supremacist images to recruit ICE agents, referring to things like remigration, showing images of a white America. There is a tapping into colonizing ideas that is explicit. For example, at one point, the Department of Homeland Security showed an image of a white woman as Manifest Destiny. It's really a famous picture, taking over the West, running out Native Americans, and striking fear in the hearts of those who were here, obviously, before Europeans showed up in the country. So this is white supremacy on steroids. And I think probably the most explicit policy that's been passed that makes clear that this is about white supremacy is the fact that all refugee programs have been shut down from around the world except for from one place, which are white South Africans. You can't really make it more plain than that. So the point is, in the United States, the remigration agenda has been put in place sort of from a top-down position through Republican anti-immigrant politics, which has become the heart of their politics, and then this administration and its allies, all of whom seem to believe that non-white immigrants are a poison. Just one last point. The administration is now starting to put in place an effort to denaturalize American citizens. So it's not just about undocumented migrants or criminal migrants, as this was described of during the campaign. This is now about also expelling American citizens whom they do not favor. It's really some of the harshest policies we've ever seen, and I think it's very explicit that they hope, which is kind of ridiculous in a country that's as multicultural and diverse as this, that they can return us to sort of an all-white past. And when I say all-white past, what they're really looking at is the pre-civil rights era. This is an attack on the 1965 Immigration Act, which ended a long period stretching back to the 20s, in which immigration was highly restricted in the United States, and in which the 1924 Immigration Act said that immigration should be only for quote unquote Nordics. I bring this up to say we've seen this before in the United States, racism in the immigration debate, and that's where they'd like to return to. So thank you very much for letting me speak about this, Evian.
Thank you very much, Heidi, for your insights and contribution. And I think we can see very starkly just how much remigration has affected the administration's policies and actions. And yeah, it's only been less than a year now of the second administration, so really quite stark. I am going to now move into a discussion between all three of you. I'd like to remind the audience that they are welcome to put questions into the Q&A box. So please do feel free to populate that with any questions that you might have for our panelists today. So I'd like to kick us off. I mean, you all have very well outlined how remigration and sort of associated policy proposals, legislative efforts are being amplified within these respective regions. I've also seen, of course, a lot of crossover when it comes to the mainstreaming of this and sort of the collapse of the cordon sanitaire across Europe, the UK, and the US. Although arguably there has been this deep-seated racism and colonial logics that have, of course, formed the undergird for the popularity of immigration. So now I wanted to turn to really what we found at the core of our research for this report around the emergence and spread of the remigration narrative online, but also, of course, we've seen how this has been influenced by as well as upon offline dynamics as well. One of the key findings with our report was that oftentimes it was local viral incidents which would create the basis for this broader idea that the public sphere is something that was dangerously overrun by violent, quote, foreigners committing crimes against the white majority population. And thus, remigration often became discussed as something that is a necessity for public safety. And here I wanted to turn to this idea of the public sphere. I am curious how each of you or any of you might see these patterns emerging within your respective regional contexts. And I think this ties back to earlier points made around long-standing legacies of colonial and racist logics, systems and structures propping up these ideas and narratives. But why do you, I mean, yeah, turning to any of you who would like to take this question, how do you see those interlinkages between racism, crime, and ideas of public safety as these opportunities for weaponization and to really, I think, allow for the perpetuation of remigration as a concept?
I might start first if that's all right. So from my perspective, it's interesting because I think that the criminality aspect has come across in all three of our contributions, and certainly if I think back, so there is a difference. We often say that these things go in cycles and that we're kind of back to where we were, but actually I think we are in a new place, And if I think back to Stuart Hall, who was a public academic who talked very much around the moral panics around what was called the Black Mugger back in the 1970s and 80s in the UK. And it was the term mugging didn't even exist. It was this a criminal act of someone having their purse or bag stolen as a kind of form of street violence. And that was very much associated with young black men. What that led to at the time was increased police powers. And so that was kind of a policing and carceral increase of the state. What we see now is criminality being responded to with a logic of expulsion. So it is about increased police powers, increased prison sentences, and the expansion and extension of state powers and the curtailment of liberty. But there is an added dimension. So here, where we're talking about criminality, particularly in the UK, particularly around Asian men, the Asian grooming scandal was the most live topic at the minute. There's an inquiry that's been re-triggered by the conversation. Again, here we have a difference. We have a moral panic around it. This is regarded as being pathological to Muslim men, and therefore the solution cannot be, the narrative states, the solution cannot be to imprison or to kind of rehabilitate. The only solution is expulsion and to remove. And so that's where I think that we've shifted direction. And so it's thinking about how these things go around and they do get recycled, but we are living a new version of it here in the UK, I think.
Shabna, I just want to say that's exactly what's happened here in the United States, right? That is the harsh deportation agenda. Migrants are criminals, and it's gone beyond the carceral and even, increasing police powers. It's the expulsion issue, and that is a difference.
Yeah, that's
And
interesting.
I have to say, from my perspective here as well, that is an element that keeps coming up all the time, and justifies, this feeling that yes, if they're not, if they're criminals, we have to start thinking of deportation and sending them back. And one of the things that happens, and I'm always sort of, braced for this, every time there is one crazy criminal act of terrorism, murder, assassination, I'm always braced for what happens next. And normally what happens is, is weaponized by the media, by politicians, the far right, and I have to say more and more mainstream, to vilify entire communities. And as you've said, Shabna, the Muslim communities get, really stigmatized and demonized for producing, people who are absolutely not Europeanized and cannot fit in. And the other thing is, now with the wars, we've seen wars generated and complicity of many of our countries that we belong to. You see wars, and the exact, the automatic reflex in Europe is, oh my God, we're going to be invaded. There's going to be another influx of refugees, and especially men coming from the global south. And so a lot of this is also, I have to say, in a sense, just not just about religion, but also gender. And, one of the things I heard when it was Ukrainian refugees coming in, initially at least, it was, yes, but these are women and children coming in, these are not men. So our societies will be safer with the Ukrainians, not just that they're white, but they're also not male, essentially, mainly. So there's a lot of, sort of sexualizing of the conversation as well when it comes to men. And that's why I mentioned Edward Said, because I think he, in his defining works, was very clear about how the emotional colonial perceptions that Europeans have of refugees, migrants, men coming from the global south. And interestingly, what's happening in Palestine now, where we're seeing how humane, how gentle, how kind, how loving Arab Muslim men are, I think that is sort of coming as a shock to many of the people that are witnessing what's happening. But communities from the day 9/11 happened, Shabna and Heidi, in Europe, Muslim communities have been vilified for the actions of one person or two people or groups, a minority. And we know from statistics, and I think your report, Evian, points to it, that many of these attacks are from the far right. In fact, and criminal activity also is mainly from criminals, whatever race or nationality they are. But the automatic reaction, the reflex, is always to point the finger at the non-integrated Muslims in our midst, the perpetual foreigners, if you like.
And it's interesting because all of the markers of being integrated, i.e., participating in a civic life, are actually seen to be as you, I think it was Shada who talked about as entryism, as kind of infiltrating and invading the systems and subverting the logics of those systems. So even where you see Muslims or Muslim communities integrating, acting within the civic kind of norms of the UK, they are treated as though they are acting in a subversive way and that they must be threatening the system or using it for some subversive, self-interested interests.
Yeah, and the intelligent ones, the ones who are integrated, are the real dangers because they are the ones who can, as you said, Shabnat, transform from within. So their power is really to be very wary of. So it's really a no-win situation in a sense, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we could discuss this for all ends and intents and purposes, but I started to see a couple of questions come in from our audience already. I think we will take this question asking, I think this is perhaps directed towards you, Heidi. This person asks, in your view, is the US following the EU and the UK, or vice versa as its policy on remigration?
Well, I think it's a little more complicated. I think there are many strands that are sort of at one moment you have the American far right learning from Hungary and from Europeans and from figures like Martin Sellner, the former neo-Nazi who really popularized this remigration term. But I think this goes both ways, right? The American government has explicitly said that they are going to intervene in European politics to help far-right political parties. So now you have Republicans working with the AfD in Germany, for example. And although relationships between Maloney's government and the Trump administration have cooled over Iran, that was a tightly building relationship. They will probably intervene for the far right in France in upcoming elections. So I don't think that this is a bi-directional, maybe multi-directional situation involving both the administration being influenced by white supremacists like Martin Sellner, who was at that secret meeting that Shada was talking about, where remigration really first came into the public consciousness. But it's going both ways, and it's being shared across white supremacist networks, being mainstreamed into the far right. The administration probably has the most power and is doing the most to act on this as a policy program. I think that's pretty clear. But Shada talked about what's happening in the EU around migration. It's also occurring there, but perhaps not as harshly and as visibly as here in the United States. So I just think it's a problem of the far right. Wherever the far right is growing, this is their messaging. This is what they're taking on, and then we find parties more in the mainstream who want to appeal to those voters accepting those policies as well, basically collapsing on their principles to get votes. And it doesn't usually work. It usually ends up making the far right more powerful. So it's a pretty big problem that we've got. And immigrants are paying, whether Muslims, folks from Latin America here, they're paying, being pathologized, being blamed for things that they do not do and aren't involved in. When you were talking about a few Muslims being blamed for crime, the Latino population in the United States has lower crime rates than the white population. And yet these sort of facts, they don't matter in this context.
It's interesting, Heidi, because my experience of racism I was born in the 1970s, and my experience of racism was very much directed to me as a brown person, and my color and complexion and my visible identity were the triggers of the racism that I experienced as a child. My daughter, I have two children, and my daughter's first experience of racism or understanding of the fact that she was different was when she was about 10, and it was when Donald Trump was first elected. So a little girl here in a primary school in East London knew of her kind of different, her otherness, when a school classmate said to her when she was a 10-year-old that, oh, do you know that there's a president in America who wouldn't allow people like you to come into the country, when he was first restricting kind of flights from Muslim majority countries. And I remember her coming home and saying to me, Ummi, what's this about? And so what you're saying, exactly, this is so interactive. I don't think it's one directional. I think it's kind of multi-directional. And we're talking about it in the UK and Europe and US context, but we also know we've got kind of in South Asia, we've got India, we've got the far right and the Hindutva. So like these, there are global links to all of these, the rise of the far right. And Heidi, you said it, we do have a problem. And I think one of the problems for us, as you described it, is the mainstreaming, where we have political parties, instead of putting up a challenge to these narratives and policies, capitulating because they believe that there is some electoral kind of benefit for them to do that. But I do not think that the evidence shows, either historically or currently, that that is the right way to move on this. And as you say, it is people of colour, communities of colour, immigrants, people seeking asylum in this country, and Muslim communities who are feeling the brunt of that.
Yeah, but we do talk a lot about the influence of the far right, and I'm the first one to admit that the many of the toxic conversations we're having now, the fact that the far right groups are, the Prime Minister of Italy is there. Viktor Orban was there. They were having summits very openly where the American MAGA movement was present. We've just seen MAGA try to interfere in the Hungarian elections. And when Marco Rubio was here, he was given a standing ovation in Munich, even though he was talking about Europe's civilizational erasure under pressure from brown and black migrants. So yes, the far right. But my research, my exploration of this, goes into the colonial, institutional, systemic racism, where the far right has found this imaginary, sort of pure white civilization that existed pre-migration, and is using it very skillfully, misusing it, and using it very skillfully. But the prejudices that I am finding now, as I sort of like an onion, peel the layers off, go very deep into racial hierarchies, religious intolerances that come from centuries ago. I was in Bosnia recently for a discussion on collective memory. And our collective memory in Europe looks at the Holocaust, rightly so, but barely acknowledges the legacy of colonialism or Europe's participation in the trade in enslaved people, barely acknowledges Islam's presence in Europe. So when we're seeing Islam only through the eyes of modern day Europe, and you do not see the contribution, the presence of Muslim empires in Europe, which was supposed to be very powerful at the time, you see Islam and Muslims as perpetual foreigners, always the intruder, always the other, always the dangerous person within our midst. And if we don't correct that perception, we don't teach our children the proper kind of colonial history. Look, I'm sitting in Brussels, and all the fabulous buildings that people go crazy over are the result of the blood, sweat, and tears of the population in the Congo. So we don't teach our children the exact the contribution of Muslim soldiers to the victory of the Allies in the Second World War, and all the different things. We will never correct. And the far right will always find a fertile ground, as I was saying, for their very noxious and toxic ideas. So we really need to go deep into this. And I think our children, Shabna, you mentioned your daughter. I have now a granddaughter who's 2 years old. And I think our children are ready for that kind of conversation. I see them questioning, I see them challenging, and I think there is hope for change. But it has to come really with a study of our history, our real history, rather than this fictional imaginary that we've created.
Shada, that's so important. I think it's exactly why the Trump administration is trying to reverse, talking about the Japanese internment here, talking about slavery, all these issues, bringing back Confederate heroes. It gets to the heart of what is a solution. That's a really good point you're making.
Yeah, thank you to all of you. I think we could go on for hours, to be honest, but now I want to give a little bit of time for some of these questions that have been coming in from our audience. So, I mean, we don't have too much more time left, so I think unfortunately we're going to have to limit it to perhaps two different questions. So I think the first one question from a journalist based in Italy, I think Shada, you in a way sort of answered this around the sort of euphemism which remigration tends to be in terms of, it's not as, it doesn't have the same connotation as, say, the Great Replacement does, right? And so oftentimes when people do hear the term remigration, they might not even realize what it is. And so this question I think is framed around, how do we create a communication strategy or even a strategy more broadly that takes these extremist concepts that are sort of pretending to have a more moderate meaning or perhaps are much more insidious in nature. Sort of how can we move forward when it comes to combating terms like remigration and help to stop its spread?
Oh, I know it sounds like a cliche, but it really is a journey because we are being bedazzled, by and benumbed, I have to say, by these bureaucratic, technocratic terms. And when people are talking about return hubs, we're talking about deportation, guys. And there are very few journalists who I think if you're in Italy, perhaps you're doing the right job because Italian journalists, I think, are questioning Meloni's policies on, Albania, setting up detention camps in Albania, for instance, or sending people to Rwanda, which was once which started in Britain, that idea, and then came over and it was accepted here. Once I wrote an article for The Guardian saying, oh, this will never happen here. I didn't say it in those words, but it was like, oh my God, how would it ever happen? But then, next year it was one of the policy proposals. So the European Commission is very skillful, and they have learned that people will not follow up because they're not really aware of the codes that are being used, the dog whistles to the far right. When you talk about European values and you create a commissioner with the prevention and protection of European values, you're really dog whistling to the far right because your values are supposed to be very, very very exclusive to Europe and nobody else can come in. So I think journalists have to be, I think, aware, so a lot of reading, and there are some guidelines that have been published by a journalist organization. I took part in some of the discussions on ethical journalism that show how we can actually challenge politicians, challenge policies by being more aware of what is really happening behind the scenes and not just falling into the trap of using quotes for their sensationalism without following up with the facts later on, So I think it is a question of being alert to the coded language that is being used. And as I said, it doesn't happen overnight. It does require a lot of focus and reflection and introspection as well.
Thank you, Chada. And Heidi and Shabna, would you like to add your thoughts on perhaps the types of interventions that could be taken, whether in society writ large, against tech platforms, perhaps to combat the spread and adoption of the remigration narrative?
Well, I'll just say that the point about the media is really critical here. My experience with trying to talk to journalists addressing this topic, just to get them to perhaps talk about why would Trump use the term remigration? What would the Office of Remigration be? There's been essentially no appetite, and that's a huge problem. When it comes to the tech companies, we have a situation in the United States that I'm not sure exactly how it applies in Europe, where there's some regulation around hate speech and disinformation. But here, with the new administration, there's been a collapse of content moderation in this space. This started, of course, when Elon Musk purchased Twitter and dismantled their trust and safety teams and essentially has turned Twitter into one of the largest hate sites on the internet. But it's happening all across these areas. So, for example, what you can say about Muslims now on Facebook is much more horrible than it used to be just a year and a half ago. Same with the LGBTQ community, but there are many more examples. Lobbying the tech companies from the American space to do something about hate speech or terms like remigration or even the Great Replacement, which used to be something that YouTube would put flags on to explain this is a racist conspiracy theory, those things are falling by the wayside. And this is a huge problem. It doesn't mean we stop trying to fight for these things, but the battle it's much more complex and difficult than it used to be. To some extent, the work that we do at the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism is try to go directly to the general public on these things, running Google ads. What is remigration? Some other way to break through this wall so that there's some general awareness about what this all means.
Yeah, I would really echo that. And I think that's really interesting to hear, Heidi, about kind of how the content moderation has impacted. I mean, we see that here, but perhaps not at the level that you've described. I think that it's really important, coming back to also what Shada said there, that journalists and the media play their kind of role in terms of acting as kind of their role in acting as a check and balance, holding kind of government and politicians to account. I think we've seen kind of that really deteriorate over the last few years. I can give you examples of when the riots were happening in summer 2024. We had journalists and the media, and including the BBC, referring to them as protests when hotels with asylum seekers inside them were being set on fire, and they were described by journalists as protests. We had descriptions of two-tier policing of those protesters, even though there was no objective evidence. And so journalists, the language that they use, accepting the sanitized language that politicians might use to try and kind of, soften some of these incredibly aggressive and dangerous policies. I think that's a really, really important part of how we kind of begin to challenge these. But also coming back to Shada's point, that I don't think it is going to be that we're going to develop a comms strategy and a media approach that's going to solve this, because there is such a deep reservoir of racism that underpins this. So no comms strategy, no media strategy is going to deal with this. Fundamentally, we need to kind of really think about how we teach ourselves about who we are, our histories, all the things that Shada said, that the education system just currently doesn't do. There is a complete erasure of that. And so we are programmed to be susceptible to these narratives precisely because we are not taught to those histories and taught to understand why the demographics of this country look the way they do. And the contributions, not in that good immigrant way, but that actually we are just part of the fabric of this society and this country. And so there is an education piece, and that is a much longer term project that needs to be undertaken.
And if I could just add to that, I mean, it's just not a question of journalists having to challenge. I think some journalists are desperately trying to actually disseminate even more racist agenda. I mean, they have a racist agenda as well. And I think we have to accept that in journalism. I see this also in some newsletters coming out here in Brussels. There is a very definite agenda to be more Islamophobic because, it can be labeled free speech. Free speech has become kind of like the smokescreen. We need to be saying this because we can't just be always, coddling our Muslim communities, And I fear, I have to say, that in a Europe that is becoming more and more unequal, in a Europe where energy prices are rising, all of this because of the wars that our countries are engaged in, complicit in. I think a lot of us should be ready now with some pre-bunking, if you like, strategies, because we're going to be heading for this, we're going to have elections in France, as you said, and we're going to have more inequalities in energy prices high and more homeless people on the streets. So there's going to be more of a feeling that, there is us and them conversations are going to become even more vocal, I think. So we should be prepared for things to get worse, I'm afraid.
Well, not to end on such a depressing note, but I guess it is not a happy topic to begin with. But I think the idea of being cognizant of the future and preparing for that and then being aware of that is necessary going forward. I'm afraid we don't have time to answer all of the questions that have been raised by the audience, but thank you so much for your engagement. I am aware that we are a bit over time now. So I would like to thank all of the panelists and for all of you who have joined us today for this really excellent and timely panel discussion. We hope that you'll continue to follow our work at CSOH. Please do subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on our social media media channels, including Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn for all the latest updates. That is also available to you in the chat with those links. And thank you all so much for taking the time to join us today, and to take care. So yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody.